going to begin. The microphones are not, as far as we know, working. So welcome everybody, both women and men. I speak as ex-equality minister. Welcome to this evening's history group, which is on the mothers of liberty, how modern liberalism was made by women. Obviously I'm not going to argue with that. It coincides with the launch of a new history group booklet, which is a series of biographies on famous women liberals, detailing their contribution. We're very lucky tonight. We've got three wonderful speakers. Jo Swinson, who you can see on the end, not, because she's coming half an hour late. But I'll begin with Dr. Helen McCabe from Oxford University. Helen is currently a stipendiary lecturer in political theory at St Edmund Hall and is a part-time tutor in philosophy at Magdalen College School and St Edward's School. And she did her thesis on John Stuart Mill, and yes, and is working on a book on Mill's socialism, as well as articles exploring many of Mill's ideas and concepts on the idea of liberal socialism. She's also working on projects about Mill's intellectual relationship with his wife, Harriet Taylor Mill, and his romanticism. So we look forward to hearing from her in a moment. And then, of course, we have Baroness Jane Bonham-Carter, who is going to be talking about the story of perhaps the most significant liberal woman of the 20th century, Violet Bonham-Carter. That is the best surname to have, I have to say.
Can I just say, those of you who thought I was going to be talking about Helena, leave now.
Jane worked in television before becoming a peer, and she spent time at both the BBC and Channel 4, and she produced programmes such as Panorama, Newsnight, Week in Politics. I've been here a very long time, and I told you everything.
No.
So I'm going to finish now and hand over to Helen, who is going to talk us through some of the biographies of some of the famous liberal women who are part of the reason, if not all of the reason, that we are here today.
Welcome very much, and thank you very much for inviting me here to speak. When I was preparing this talk, I started by thinking about the title, Mothers of Liberty, and also the claim, as I got it in the email at least, how modern liberalism was made by women. In a way, it's a slightly ironic title. Many of the women who did most of the cause of liberty in the 19th century at least, by very virtue of this public activity, either chose not to or prevented from being the mothers of anyone. Whilst it was motherhood which ended the life of that most famous liberal woman, Mary Wollstonecraft. Moreover, even amongst those who were married, and indeed mothers, there was a drive to change our perception of women away from being either wives and mothers, and into being beings in their own right. Similarly, although it was to the 19th century Liberal Party that these mothers of liberty looked to extend the rights enjoyed by men to women, their pleas fell not only on deaf but often on opposed ears. So when John Stuart Mill was a Liberal MP, proposed an amendment to the Reform Act of 1867, only 73 MPs out of 269 who voted supported him. However, as we all know, liberalism is not coextensive with the Liberal Party in the 19th century, and if we take liberalism to be founded in the idea that liberty is a fundamental good, and that all human beings have a right to a free, flourishing and self-directed life, then women in the 19th century certainly helped to make liberalism really mean all human beings, and not, as had been the language of earlier liberal declarations, all men. And so I'd like to talk in some detail about 5 women in particular. I'm afraid not exactly the ones you promised in the advert, but mainly the ones I actually know about. Otherwise you would have had sort of just Wikipedia, which you probably don't want. So they're Mary Wollstonecraft, Anna Wheeler, Harriet Martineau, Harriet Taylor Mill, obviously, and Helen Taylor. Alright, so I'm sure everyone here knows about Mary Wollstonecraft already. I'm going to take them in roughly chronological order. And there's more in this fabulous pamphlet. She's become one of the most famous women of the 18th century. But this has actually only recently become the case. She was relatively unknown even just 20 years after her death. Her reputation in tatters after the publication of her husband's memoir of her, though that wasn't actually what he meant to happen. Indeed, despite his great interest in the French Revolution and in women's rights, John Stuart Mill, I promise I won't talk about him too much, though only born 9 years after her death, makes no mention of Wollstonecraft in any surviving text or letter, public or private, and as far as we can tell from his remaining library, didn't have any of her books. Moreover, she suffered a little in being seen as merely derivative of Thomas Paine, a kind of feminist add-on, if you like. But this does her a disservice as a philosopher. Her less read Vindication of the Rights of Man was written a year before Paine's, and is, like his, a direct response to Edmund Burke's criticisms of the French Revolution. And her Vindication of the Rights of Woman is a response to Rousseau, and in particular, his advice for the very different education of boys and girls in Emile and Sophie. So in the Vindication, Wollstonecraft shows that if we base man's rights to liberty in our fundamental nature as humans, and in what separates us from other animals, then there could be no plausible excuse for not giving these rights to women. It's reason, she says, which is distinctively human, virtue which makes us a good human, and experience which, when reason is brought to bear on it, makes us virtuous. By banning women from using their reason, allowing them very few opportunities for experience, and telling them that a virtuous woman looked very different from a virtuous man, indeed that womanly virtues are things that, if men adopted them, would be called ignoble, despicable, effeminate, society, and in particular men, are preventing women from being properly human and denying them self-evident and even God-given rights. So when Wollstonecraft urged women to be educated to use their reason, and a common liberal cry then as now, for society to be rearranged according to reason and not custom and prejudice. Her contribution to liberal theory then is right at the beginning of practical political talk about fundamental rights, to insist on those rights in the face of conservative criticism, and to try and ensure that those rights were accorded to women, to insist that women had natural rights just as much as men did, and to try and break down gendered ideas of virtue, instead insisting that women, like men, were individuals in their own rights, and ought to do as their reason dictated, not abiding by socially imposed concepts of decent, virtuous, or womanly, especially when these are such different standards to those imposed on men. Her political theory then both makes the case of liberalism's foundational premises and attempts to make liberalism more inclusive. So like all the women I've mentioned, and we'll talk about more, Wollstonecraft fought to extend liberal principles to women, not only through her philosophical writings, but in how she made what Mill, I think this might be the last mention until we get to Harriet, would later call experiments in living, challenging contemporary preconceptions of what women could and should do, and of the rectitude of traditional marital relations and other things, and challenging ways in which women are oppressed in society. So Wollstonecraft, as you'll learn more in the booklet, was born in London in 1759 into what appears to have been a rather abuse-ridden household. As a teenager, she'd sleep in front of her mother's door to protect her from her father's drunken rages, like some kind of medieval squire. After a varied career as companion to a very rich lady in Bath, school teacher and governess, which informed her early work, Thoughts on the Education of Daughters, she became a writer, a particularly revolutionary choice at the time. She said she wanted to be a new breed to her sister, translating texts from French and German and writing reviews. She had a relationship with a married artist, suggested a platonic menage a trois, which his wife rejected, perhaps unsurprisingly, whereupon Wollstonecraft went to France, where in the tumultuous milieu of the post-revolutionary Paris, she arrived just before the execution of the king, she embarked upon an affair with Gilbert Imlay, who's been described as an American adventurer. You don't get exciting people like that anymore. All these women make me feel like I've lived an incredibly boring life. Yes. There we are. I've never met an American adventurer. Only been to Paris once. Within a year, she was pregnant. I've also not done that. Having evidently rethought her dismissal of sexual relations in the Vindication, went to have her baby, who she named Fanny after a childhood friend. And because she evidently had a lot of time on her hands, right, she wrote a history of the early days of the Revolution, just to fill it in. Right. Imlay, however, soon left her, and when she followed him to London with their child, rejected her. Apparently saved her from an attempted suicide attempt, after which she travelled to Scandinavia on her own with a 2-year-old to try and recoup some of his business losses. On her return, she realised the relationship really was over, and after walking up and down in the rain on a day like today, I imagine, to make her clothes wet enough to make her sink, she threw herself in the Thames. But luckily, a passing stranger rescued her. Okay. Definitely, it's just incredible. So her account of travelling in Scandinavia, she published that, all the letters, she published them, had however been read by the philosopher and anarchist William Godwin. They'd met a few years before, and neither had been very impressed with the other. He wanted to meet Thomas Paine, and this annoying woman just talked to him all night. She thought he was quite dull, but there we are. He was very impressed with the book, and Godwin wrote, "If ever there was a book calculated to make a man fall in love with its author, this appears to me to be that book." They met again through mutual friends and soon fell deeply in love. And when Mary realised she was pregnant, they decided to get married so that child would be legitimate, and that child, as I'm sure everybody knows, went on to be Mary Shelley. Yes, right, Frankenstein. Sadly, Wollstonecraft contracted puerperal fever and died 10 days after giving birth in 1797. So it's hard to imagine a less typical life for a woman at the end of the 18th century. It's fairly hard to imagine a less difficult life for a woman at the beginning of the 21st century. That the world was not perhaps quite ready for it then or now. As already noted, Godwin's loving memoir served only to destroy her reputation and leave Wollstonecraft almost unregarded until the 20th century. And her challenging of social mores had proof that women could do more than was usually assumed, a lot more, and in her philosophical writing, which clearly asserts humanity's rights to fundamental freedom and woman's right to be considered an equal part of humanity, I think we can say that Wollstonecraft helped shape modern liberalism, despite having less impact than one might think on the generation following her. But one woman that it seems she did influence, because we know she read her, is Ada Wheeler, the joint author with William Thompson of, let's take a deep breath here, right, an appeal on one half of the human race, women, against the pretensions of the other half, men, to retain them in political and thence in civil and domestic slavery. Right, so not a title that trips off the tongue, granted, but it is a brilliant analysis of the damage done to women by gender stereotypes, a lack of education and a lack of rights within marriage. Thompson and Wheeler wrote the appeal as a response to James Mill's essay on government, where he wrote that women's interests could be adequately represented by men and therefore they didn't need the vote. But its purview is much wider. Again, they blame a lack of proper education and social oppression for women's apparent inability to, and in many cases lack of desire to reason as well as men, or take an active part in public life as men, argued that women would be much happier if their faculties of mind and body should be fully cultivated, and insist on women's rights to enter all walks of life and gain as much of an education as they can and enjoy the fruits of it. They insist that marriage is a form of slavery in which women are unfree and oppressed. They extort women to demand perfect equality with men. They favour family planning and the use of contraception to free women from the dangers of multiple pregnancies. And finally, they suggest that if women join cooperative societies, both of them are anarcho-socialists, which is quite fitting. But Brighton, William King, first kind of cooperative socialist houses like around Children's Yards down the lot that way. Then they could engage in some form of communal living, which would also free them from a life of domestic servitude. So in this, they move on from Wollstonecraft in many ways, though retaining the same basic core principles. Women ought to be treated and viewed as equals, and to be accorded the same rights, which will secure this equality, amongst which must be provision for women to be free and independent. So Wheeler herself was born in Tipperary, and married when she was 15, an abusive alcoholic. After 12 years, she separated from him, and in what's quite a revolutionary step, she took her daughters with her and went to live in Guernsey with an uncle, and then moved in 1815 to London, and then in 1816 to France. In fact, for the rest of her life, at least I would love, she managed to remain travelling, staying with friends. Friends like these, primarily in London, Caen, Dublin and Paris. I think we take those four, right? When her husband died in 1820, he left her penniless, and so, like Wollstonecraft before, she made a living by translating works, in particular the works of Charles Fourier, the French socialist who predicted that the growing harmony of the universe would lead the polar ice caps to melt, causing the sea to taste of pink lemonade. And that currently wild animals would, in the future, harmoniously help humans. For instance, the anti-lion would take people on its back and gallop across the country much faster than a horse and carriage. Anti-sharks would round up fish for fishermen, and anti-hippopotamuses would pull boats down rivers. In London, Wheeler met the philosopher William Godwin. There's a lot of philosophers in this and a lot of Williams, right? And they developed a very close friendship. She was part of the group of radicals associated with the Unitarian Reverend William Fox, who eventually became too radical even for Unitarians, if that's possible, and founded a free-thinking society. Wheeler died in 1848, obviously, still campaigning for radical politics, but she did kind of send a sick note when she was invited to join the revolutions in Paris. And she died that year. Again, she challenged contemporary thinking about women's notes and potential, and contributed to liberal philosophy both in insisting that women were morally men's equals and ought to be legally, but in identifying aspects of what we might not think of as patriarchy, which were making women oppressed and unfree. Something which some aspects of modern liberal theory has directly engaged with, although there are lots of feminists who don't think liberalism can't possibly go far enough, but that's something for a different talk. Right, so moving on from Anna Wheeler, who I was racing through, Harriet Martineau was also part of William Fox's radical utilitarian circle. Martineau made theoretical contributions to liberalism on two fronts, at least. Firstly, she was a well-respected and popular laissez-faire economist, whose first works, Illustrations of Political Economy, is a sort of fictionalised account of economics, and it catapulted her to fame in 1832. That was just a reading mistake, I didn't spell it right first time. Her first work, however, was on the unfairness of women's education, and apparently on discovering she was the author, her brother said, "Now dear, you leave it to the other women to make skirts and darn stockings, and you devote yourself to this." And her other contributions to liberal theory in works like Household Education, Life in the Cyprian and Society in America, with its highly critical chapter, The Political Non-Existence of Women, is, like Wollstonecraft and Wheeler, to stand up for liberal principles and to demand that they be equally applied to women. Martineau herself remained single, despite her father's encouragement and the assumptions of the Darwin family on the probable outcome of her friendship with Charles Darwin's brother Erasmus, which may have been in order to avoid the oppression she saw women were subjected to and retain her hard-won financial independence as a popular novelist and journalist. Despite being plagued by ill health, Martineau, after his death, was also an active campaigner for women's rights, petitioning Parliament on the suffrage, women's education, access to professions, and on the repeal of the Contagious Diseases Act. She built herself a house in Ambleside, broke with her family when she rejected religion, and a really shocking thing for the time, wrote and published her own autobiography, and she also wrote her own obituary for the paper she worked for. Like Wollstonecraft and Wheeler then, Martineau also lived her own life, becoming a practical example of all that women could do and be. Also in William Fox's circle was Harriet Taylor. Taylor's most famous published work is her Enfranchisement of Women, she wrote in 1951, where she specifically tackles the notion of the disingenuousness with which men, in documents such as the American Declaration of Independence, is taken to mean merely men and not all human beings. Points out fundamental inconsistencies and professed principles of English law and their practice, so women pay taxes but they don't have any representation, women are never tried by their peers because they're always tried by men. It makes the case for the injustice of the fact that the means to an independent living are denied women, with access to an education and the professions being ring-fenced to keep women out, and that the very thought of women taking an active role in public life is dismissed as being unfeminine, and insists that it's bad, and this I guess is her real kind of new contribution, is that it's bad for both women and for men, for one half of humanity to be born to rule over the other. Repeating the fundamental liberal principle that no portion of the species has the right to decide for another portion, or any individual for another individual, what is and what is not their proper sphere of action. Rather, that the proper sphere for all human beings is the largest and highest which they are able to attain to, and that this can never be achieved without complete liberty of choice. Also of interest, if you're a theorist at least, is a letter to Mill in 1831, in which she basically formulates the harm principle, that founding tenet of liberalism, writing, "Every human being has a right to all personal freedom which does not infringe with the happiness of some other," as well as her insightful critique of the inability of women to become individuals in contemporary marriage, where they're entirely subject to the arbitrary will of another. Her sketches of what marriage might look like if it was a union of equals, her arguments about the debilitating nature of women's economic dependence on men, and her arguments against the idea that men and women have fundamentally different natures. There's also the much debated question of will influence in Mill's work, but that again is enough for a whole talk and a book, hopefully. Right, so Harriet's personal life is in many ways less flamboyant than those of the women whose biographies I've previously sketched. But even so, she managed an experimental living that again aided the application of liberal principles to women by showing that they were capable of more than was usually assumed, and that conventional mores were often restrictive of their individual development rather than reflecting their nature. So she was born in London, daughter of Thomas Hardy, but not the novelist, and was married at 17 to a prosperous businessman, John Taylor. Her letters to him reveal that she seemed very much in love, and not perhaps as anti-sex as some contemporary feminists. She writes him quite nice letters about longing to see his head on the pillow when she wakes up in the morning.
Oh.
Yeah, sweet. Taylor's had 3 children in fairly swift succession, Algernon, Herbert, and Helen, more about whom in a second. And while she was pregnant with Helen in 1831, Harriet met John Stuart Mill, and it was the start of a life-changing love affair for both of them. In the autumn of 1833, they eloped to Paris, risking both his and her political and philosophical careers, but in the end determined on what became one of the most scandalous compromises of the 19th century, with Harriet living with her husband, but regularly seeing Mill and apparently sleeping with neither of them. After a few years, she moved to her yes, apparently, I think it's probably the best word there. Right, after a few years, she moved to her own house, although she returned to live with her husband in 1849 when he was dying of stomach cancer. After a lot of soul searching, given their opposition to the institution of marriage, Harriet and Mill married in 1851, which was almost more scandalous than their previous relationship, as this confirmed some people's worst thoughts and looked as though Mill was finally making an honest woman of him. In fact, his mum and sister didn't speak to him after it, and neither did his brother, because he thought, you don't agree with marriage, why have you married her? Unfortunately, Harriet's health was declining. Indeed, they both thought they were going to die in 1854 and worked hard to write everything they wanted to say. They raced towards Italy, where it was thought the climate was better for sufferers from TB, but Harriet died en route in Avignon. Mill was so devastated that he not only built her a tomb from Carrara marble, inscribed with a long eulogy, there's actually no room to put his name on the grave. It has to go on the side, because the whole top is filled with how wonderful she was. And wrote a heart-wrenching dedication to her in Our Liberty, which you might have seen or read, and continued to spend much of his life in Avignon, buying a house overlooking her grave. On Harriet's death, her daughter Helen Taylor raced to Avignon to find a stepfather so grief-stricken he barely moved for days, and so this, I think, is the point at which to introduce a woman with a rather different kind of impact on liberalism. So Helen Taylor was born in 1831, was mainly brought up by her mother Harriet, but as it were, she had two father figures, John Taylor and John Stuart Mill. Harriet wanted to give Helen all the advantages she hoped all women would one day have, including a good education. And in her early 20s, Helen declared she wanted to be an actress, and was actually acting in Sunderland when she heard of her mother's death. Afterwards, she dedicated herself to campaigning for women's rights, founding the London National Society for Women's Suffrage, and with other campaigners like Blanche Bodichon, who founded the first Women's Suffrage Committee, and Lydia Becker, Secretary of the Manchester Suffrage Committee, I'm sure they're all in there, petitioned Parliament for women's votes. Indeed, when Edward Kent Carslake, the Tory MP for Colchester, said the main reason he was not supporting Mill's amendments, which would have given women the vote in 1867, was that he knew no women in his own constituency who wanted it, Helen, along with Lydia Becker and Frances Power, set off to Colchester and returned with 129 names on a petition of women who did indeed want the vote, thank you very much, which, to do him with credit, Carslake did duly present to Parliament. Helen Taylor was also supportive of women's education, was involved in the founding of Somerville College, right in Modifo, giving it the library she had inherited on her death in 1905. She and Mill were also heavily involved in campaigns against domestic violence and in opposing the Contagious Diseases Act. So some modern feminists have argued that these women are too optimistic about what an extension of rights will achieve. But on the other hand, their position was almost unimaginable in its lack of rights, and they were certainly correct in thinking rights were necessary. Similarly, they rarely discuss maternity pay, right, though some do tackle the injustice of women having to do domestic labour as well as work, and even suggest men getting involved in work around the house, though few tackle the question of men having a new and hands-on parenting role. But it'd be wrong to see these 19th century women as blind to problems of patriarchy, which mere equality of rights cannot entirely fix, for they are all aware of the inhibiting effect on women of ideology, religion, culture and expectations, of all things in fact, that to use some political theory jargon, would make women effectively unfree, no matter how formally free she becomes with the grant of equal rights. But indeed, this too is where women of the long 19th century have shaped modern liberalism, with their sometimes neglected analysis of what else, apart from formal freedoms, prevent women from being free, and their interesting writings on the unfairness of the different ideas of virtue applied to men and women, their challenging of accepted sexual morality, their challenging of ideas of what women can and should be. Most fundamentally, of course, it comes back to that basic liberal tenet that all people should be free, and that the only freedom worth the name is that of pursuing your own conception of the good in your own way. Extending that to women, as those in the 19th century knew, needs a lot more than a simple extension of rights, but rights are a fundamental first step. Modern liberalism and liberal theory, as well as modern feminist theory, is interestingly engaged in asking what else we need to do to make liberal principles properly universal, and in that shape it's been shaped and informed by women, not least the ones I've mentioned, and even more the ones in the book.
Wow. I just think that was a fantastic and interesting gallop.
Thank you, sorry.
And what a continuum there is, unfortunately. not everything has been won, and I'm sorry you haven't had an American adventurer yet. Anyway, I'm going to now ask Jane to talk about violence.
Well, even more, can I just start by thanking Duncan for asking me to do this, because it's made me look back on my grandmother's life and be reminded about how remarkable, actually, her life, what she did as a woman was. She was born in the 19th century, so 1887. She was the daughter of Herbert Henry Esquith and his first wife, Helen Melland, who tragically died when she was very young. And at the time of Violet's birth, he was an MP, but he had just entered the House of Commons, sorry, but his ascent was absolutely rapid. He was became Home Secretary in Gladstone's last administration, and in 1905 he was Chancellor, in 1908 he was Prime Minister. Violet's lifetime covered, to use old-fashioned terms, which she would appreciate, the zenith and the nadir of the Liberal Party. And she occupied a ring-sized seat from which she never deserted. She remained loyal to the party throughout her life, despite its decline, and through all the splits and divisions. She was there in 1906 when the Liberal Party, swept to a landslide victory with 400 seats. She was there when, in 1918, 2 years after her father was Prime Minister, he lost his seat. She was there in 1955 when we were down to 6 seats. A woman of formidable intellect. Her stepmother, Margaret Asquith, writing in 1920, describes her, and this is very old-fashioned, I have to say, but though intensely feminine, she would have made a remarkable man. I do not believe there is an examination she could not have passed, either at school or university. Her gift of expression, more importantly, was amazing, and her memory unrivaled. Winston Churchill, who was her sort of other great sort of passion, as it were, other than my grandmother, obviously, was referred to her as a woman of such vehement intelligence. And I think that's very interesting, vehement. She was a passionate liberal all her life. She worshipped her father, and he depended on her. And after his fall from power, first of all he was ejected from being Prime Minister in 1916, then he lost his seat in 1980. She became his standard bearer, discovering her own, actually, considerable gifts as an orator during his successful campaign to return to House of Commons in the by-election in Paisley in 1918. Her father, Winston Churchill observed, found in his daughter a champion redoubtable. And Margot, her stepmother, who she had a good relationship with, recorded in her autobiography, her speeches in her father's election at Paisley brought her before a general, as well as, this is again not sort of snobbish, intellectual audience, from which she can never retire. And whenever she appears on a platform, the public shout from every part of the hall, calling upon her to speak. And Violet memorably described Asquith's return to Parliament in a speech at the National Liberal Club. This is her peroration. One last scene. The closing scene of the drama of Paisley. Remember, this man had been Prime Minister. The sight of those great cheering crowds that thronged Whitehall and Parliament Square the day he took his seat. But when I went in, out of the noise, into the silence of the house in which I had seen him lead great armies to great triumphs, when I saw that little gallant handful of men, which is all his following now, and I heard their thin cheer raised, for a moment I felt, is this all? Are these all he has behind him? But then I remembered the great voice of the crowd, and I knew that our small force that day was like the gallant garrison of a beleaguered city that hears for the first time the great shout to the relieving forces. Hold on, hold out, we are coming. And how often during her life she had to believe those words. She continued after Asquith's death to be his most resolute defender and the voice of Asquithian liberalism. However, in the words of Mark Pottle, who, after my father died, edited her diaries and letters and was an incredible chronicler of what she had done, he said, I agree with him, she never ceased to interpret to modern times the liberal ideals that she had learnt from her father in childhood, which were Edwardian ideals after all. And not just her father. Her politics, her faith was nurtured, forged by active participation from an incredibly early age, on the hustings, speaking her first reported speech. I'm sad that actually Jo isn't here, because, but it was when she was 22. But she also listened to and interacted with those other great liberals of that time, Lloyd George and Churchill. And of course Churchill, along with her father, was the dominant political figure in her life. She first met him when she was 19. And this is her description of their first meeting. They're sitting next to each other at dinner or whatever. He turned on me a lowering gaze and asked me abruptly how old I was. I replied, I was 19. And I am, he said, almost despairingly, 32 already. Younger than anyone else who counts, though, he added. I think it's quite interesting. As if to comfort himself. He ended up with the word, oh no, sorry, younger than him. Sorry, I missed that. Sorry, I'm not Helena. I missed the point. Anyway, he ended up with the words, I will always remember this as valid. We are all worms, but I do believe that I am a glowworm. And despite occasional differences of opinion pursued vigorously on both sides, no one, she said, knew better how to perform the public service of putting the cat among the pigeons in Churchill. They remained devoted friends. After her father's death, she dropped out of politics, but her personal interest never ceased. Awake, or it seems asleep, looking back at her diaries, I found this extract from a letter she wrote to Churchill on a Boxing Day. This is her. I dreamt all Christmas Eve that I was discussing with you the rival merits of second ballot, PR and alternative vote, and woke up exhausted, underlined, and convinced that all would result in ruin. Anyway, there we are. But the rise of the Nazis in Germany brought her back. We've missed my... She was an early and active supporter of Churchill's anti-appeasement campaign, and in 1933 she vigorously attacked Franz von Papen for the deal he broke in 1933 Adolf Hitler, which led to the Nazi leader's appointment as Chancellor. She joined a group led by Churchill to fight appeasement, and at a rally in the Albert Hall produced, I think, a really memorable phrase, which is, let us prove, as prove we can, that democracy, and this is the phrase I'm referring to, that great army that needs no uniform, is not played out. And this brings me to a point that I feel very strongly about my grandmother, that she was prescient and had foresight. She, coupled with energy, which she pursued her causes, she was always ahead of the game. She was anti-appeasement. She was anti-Suez. She was anti-apartheid. She was anti the death penalty. She was a champion of beverage and social reform. She was pro-Europe. She was pro-abortion. sorry if that's the right way of putting it, and that may not be the right way, but the right to choose. She was pro-gay rights, though that would not have been her use of words. She was pro-immigration. She spoke out against what was being done to the Kenyan immigrants. We tend to think about Ugandan, but there was the Kenyan Asian expulsion before that. She was actually pro-women's rights and pro-equal pay. And in a broadcast she made in 1943, she argued that the unknown warrior was actually women, the mothers and the housewives of the nation. And when the war was over, she took up the standard of equal pay, believing that was something she felt was a moral right. She was herself a mother of 4 children, and unfortunately, in my view, believed that active politics and family life were incompatible. I hope Joe doesn't think that. The critical moment came after the Paisley by-election, when she recalls having received 14 invitations to stand as a candidate. But by then she had 2 small daughters, and she felt they must come first, and she didn't see how the 2 things could work. She finally stood at Wells in 1945 and Coal Valley in 1951, both which she lost. And she only entered Parliament as a life peer at the age of 77, where she made an immediate impact on the House of Lords, although it did not make an impact on her. She impatiently described it as, I'm not going to make any comment here, the corridors of impotence. In the 50s, when the Liberal Party almost disappeared, and I don't know if you know this, but of the 6 MPs returned in the general election of 1955, only her son-in-law, Joe Grimmond, faced a Tory and Labour opponent. In every other seat, there were local packs. She was one of a handful of people who kept it going. She travelled everywhere, all weathers. She addressed village halls, all over the country, as well as tirelessly canvassing and campaigning alongside those who were fighting to keep liberalism alive. Among these, of course, were Joe, who was married to Laura, my aunt, and my father, Mark, who won the Torrington by-election. But of course he lost the seat. I mean, I was the baby in the Torrington by-election. I'm afraid that shows my age. And he lost the seat in the general election that followed. This provokes an unusual, actually, moment of despondency as she recognises what faced the younger generation. She wrote in her diaries, "The heritage which meant such glory in my youth has been a frustration and a lost cause for them, if only she'd lived until this time." Anyway, her influence was not just due to her grassroots activism. Her opposition to the British-run the Suez crisis arguably helped the party and Joe Grimmond acquire a distinctive position on a crucial issue. And she was an internationalist, a fervent believer in the League of Nations and the UN. She embraced Europe. Her father had been strongly opposed to the Versailles Treaty after the First World War, as was she, and she embraced post-Hitler Germany, becoming an annual member of the Königswinter Conference. She was a polymath, sensitive to beauty, visual and musical, and a lover of literature. She was the governor of the Old Vic, trustee of the Glyndebourne Arts Trust. She was also governor of the BBC and a frequent and celebrated broadcaster on both radio and television. One of the things my father used to tell me, which he loved, was when she was asked to go on French radio, and they thought we've got this old woman, and she went into a blistering attack of General de Gaulle about his veto of us joining Europe in her Edwardian French. I think it caused considerable concern. Anyway, to sum up, Violet Asquith, I like to think of her, was a wonderful daughter, a deeply loving mother, an absolutely terrible mother-in-law, a fascinating grandmother, and a great great liberal. And she used to tell me, I think my sister's back, a thrilling and scary story about a Bluebeard called Mr. Fox, who was about to be married to the lovely Lady Mary. And Lady Mary became a little concerned about Mr. Fox, and so she went to find where he lived, and she comes to his gateway, and she sees written on it, "Be bold, be bold." And she is bold. She goes through. And she comes to the next door, and it says, be bold, but not too bold, but being Lady Mary, or indeed Violet." She goes through. And the next gateway says, be bold, but not too bold, lest your heart's blood should run cold. And of course, she goes through it, and I think that sums up my grandmother. Her heart's blood never ran cold.
Thank you very much, Joan. I mean, a most amazing woman, but to have that in your own family is just unimaginable in terms of history. And now we turn to Jo Swinson, who, at the time of writing the pamphlet, was PPS to our Deputy Prime Minister, and is now a business minister, which I'm sure we're all delighted to see her do. And she's going to talk to us about liberal women in the modern day sense. So over to you, Jo.
Thank you, Lynn. I'm going to stand up so that I can see people at the back. First of all, sincere apologies for being late. As a woman, I've been multitasking in this particular fringe slot, and I had 3 events that all clashed with it, so I've come from 2 previous events, which I wouldn't normally be as overbooked as that, but it is partly as a result of the reshuffle that I've been trying to take on some of Norman's commitments, and he's been taking on Worston's commitments and so on. Obviously there is a great heritage of liberal women, but I think in the party that we see today, and looking back perhaps over the last couple of decades, we have seen some quite fantastic women. And the first person I would like to mention is someone who certainly has been an inspiration to me, and who I was rather terrified in the year 2001 to have to follow in a conference speech where I disagreed with her, and that is Shirley Williams, who has, to me, just articulated a most rational but with an emotional intelligence view of the world, whether it's been on television or at conferences, and I think in some ways, you know, had she been a few decades later, then probably would have been leader of our party. And she, everything from her time as education minister, obviously as a member of another party, to within our party, her commitment to making sure that we supported the minimum wage back in 1984, her work even just last year on the NHS. She has proved to be such an intellectual star, but has also been so personally supportive to other women in the party, and I find that, I'm sure the others on the panel here have as well, that she is truly a giant in terms of women within the Liberal Democrats, and has indeed spanned the decades and the generations, and you know, in her 80s is you know, quite astonishing the way she had the energy and to act as if she's, you know, practically a teenager. I always think that Shirley, one of the delights is that she isn't a conformist. She didn't stick to all of the rigours. Having read her autobiography, you know, the wayward hair and whatever, you know, she's just Shirley. She's herself, and I just think that's one of the most wonderful things about her. I also want to pay tribute to Lynn as the party's first equalities minister. And the work that she has done tirelessly within government, championing whether it's issues around domestic violence, the rape crisis, equal marriage, very courageously. It's easy to forget that that was not in the coalition agreement, and yet we're going to make it happen. And you know, within our team of of women Liberal Democrats, MPs and peers that we've had over the last few years. I mentioned her last night, Sandra Gidley. That was my first experience of campaigning, with getting Sandra elected. And Sandra used to tell a really interesting story about when she joined the Parliamentary Party, and some of the male MPs would come up to her and would say, "So, we're all very interested to know, will you be like a Ray, or like a Jenny, or like a Jackie?" And she said, "I think I'll be like a Sandra." And I mean, it is sad that we've probably at various points had more members of our parliamentary party called David than women, or Mark, or whatever. We're probably not quite in that situation now, but yeah, there's only 7 of us in the Commons Party, and we had a really sore loss at the last election of Sandra, and we have Susan, who is just smashing, and thankfully now in the House of Lords, and indeed Julia. And I remember vividly sitting and watching the election results from what was supposed to be a wonderful election night, because we'd had all of Tasmania, and I mean, frankly, I could not have imagined a better election campaign as a Liberal Democrat. And then we saw these exit polls, and you're kind of going, "Well, that can't be right." As it turned out, it wasn't right, it was too generous for us. And hoping that that would be a sort of bright spot, Julia getting re-elected, and tweeting, and I heard the result, and I thought, "Oh, that's great, Julia's got re-elected." And then realising, actually, although they were both 18,000, I hadn't quite processed the final numbers, and by 66 votes, I think it was, that she had lost. I mean, the Parliamentary Party's loss is Danny Alexander and government's gain, because she's doing a fantastic job as a special advisor. But we went from nine women MPs to 7, and thankfully with the addition of the wonderful, effervescent Tessa Mont, who is absolutely unique and in many ways it probably makes up for several MPs, because she force of personality is so big. But it's very clear that we need to expand that number. We saw Sarah Tether on the stage this morning, and the work that she did on ending child detention is absolutely inspirational. And Sarah has long been a role model of mine, and indeed we've been good friends before either of us even got elected. I have vivid memories of driving Sarah around Taunton constituency in my little yellow gold Nissan Micra, and visiting local members when she went for selection in that seat. She didn't win it, as it turned out. She got elected a couple of years ahead of Jeremy Brown, who did. And I think she's a fantastic role model, and we still, as a party, despite the fact she's no longer in ministerial office, we absolutely need to be harnessing the talents of Sarah. I'm delighted to see Jenny Willett, one of our colleagues, finally getting some of the recognition that she deserves, because I think she's been somebody that seems to have been overlooked at subsequent reshuffles and so on under various leaders. And the time that Jenny spent as Deputy Chief Whip, you hear a lot in politics about how the Whip's office operates, and it's all just about shouting at MPs and telling them to vote the right way. And what Jenny really implemented in her time as Deputy Chief Whip in opposition, and that she is also making a reality in government, is actually around the Whip's office being about HR and continuing personal development, and making sure that we actually get the support and skills development that we need. We see someone like Kirsty Williams in Wales, our first leader of one of our parties within the UK, not just as the first leader, Lib Dems as a leader of a party, but also the first female leader of any of the larger Welsh parties. And the stuff that she's actually delivering, despite not being in government at all, despite the fact that we have, I think, 5 AMs in Wales, because they have a situation of minority government, she has gone in and she's negotiated hard, and she is delivering with the Labour minority government the pupil premium in Wales, and that would not be happening without Kirsty Williams and the Welsh Liberal Democrats. But I think it's important in talking about our parliamentarians to also remember all of the unsung heroes. Because so many of the people that have built this party and have kept it going through very many of the difficult years when it was a very small spark that could have been snuffed out, so many of those people have been women. And I think it's great that we have in the party, through the Patsy Carlton Award and the Harriet Smith Award, a mechanism to remember and to remember those fantastic women, but also to celebrate the achievements of these unsung heroes in our party. And I think that is absolutely hugely, hugely important. And this event is called Mothers of Liberty, so if you'll indulge me. I would also like to pay tribute to my own mother, who I think is one of these unsung heroes. Because, they often say that behind every, successful MP is the constituency wife. And I don't have a wife. We may be legislating to make that possible, although I'm not sure what Duncan would have to say about it. But my mother has been absolutely crucial in helping me to do what I've done in my home seat. I have a vivid memory of when I was still working in Yorkshire and commuting back every weekend to Glasgow to fight the selections, particularly for the West of Scotland regional list. And I worked for a radio station, so I didn't have the kind of job where I would be wearing a suit at work. And I remember getting the train back to Glasgow Central Station, and Mum meeting me at the station with my suit and I had these shoes that I was wearing, and I think I'd worn them to a wedding somewhere that were covered in mud. Anyway, so there's me in the toilets of Glasgow Central Station, changing into my suit. Mum's there at the sink trying to sort out my shoes and get the mud off them so that they don't just look like I've walked into a field. And then I'm hastily putting a bit of makeup on, and then she drives me to this hustings event that I'm having to speak at in the evening. Having had to take probably a half day to leave work early to get there from Yorkshire. And I just thought it would have just been impossible for me to do that without that kind of support. Or when I was out campaigning in the evenings after working my full-time job, and I got home and I was just exhausted and cold and wet, because my constituency's in the west of Scotland. And it's dark outside, and Mum just goes, would you like a bowl of soup? Would you like a cup of tea? And it just totally rescued my life and the ability for me to be able to get up the next morning and go to work, and then as soon as I finished at 5:30 to go straight to go knocking on doors, and then get home at 10 o'clock at night and do the whole thing again. And it's people like my mum that do that, and they do that up and down the country in lots of different constituency parties, and nobody kind of thanks them for it particularly. My mum always amazed she is, and she says, I can't believe all these people come and deliver leaflets for you. And they do it out of ideology, not out of love. And she says, that's why I do it. And in the run-up to the 2005 election, my dad was working abroad, and my mum and I would have this kind of routine at weekends, and we'd get up early in the morning, and we'd head off to Bishopbriggs, which was an area in my constituency where we had no deliverers, we had no real presence apart from one small ward, but was clearly crucial because it was quite a Labour area. So every vote we won there was like 2 votes, because it was a vote off Labour. So we were delivering more than we did in our health wards. We were delivering the town once a month, basically through me and my mum at weekends. And we'd go there with our trainers on, and we'd deliver all day. I'd be listening to Radio 4 on my mobile phone. We'd kind of have little toilet stops built in at the local supermarket, and sit and eat lunch in the car and so on. And then we'd come back in time to watch Strictly Come Dancing, normally with a takeaway curry. And that was basically sort of the winter weekends for us. And I don't know how you give thanks for that kind of thing, frankly. It's totally beyond the call of duty, but I know that there's women doing that up and down in the party. So, as the new Minister for Women, I feel just a huge amount of pride, but also humility, to be sort of standing on these shoulders and taking forward this agenda. I'm determined and I'm delighted that we are managing to make a real difference for women. I'm so excited about the proposals to take forward flexible working, to take forward shared parental leave, to start to make a real difference for women in the workplace. But I'm also very, very aware we have a long way to go. There's 7 of us out of 57 in the Commons Parliamentary Party. The Cabinet is still overwhelmingly male. As an ex-PPS, I got to sit in the room, and the 2 things that struck me the first time I went was, my God, we're outnumbered on 2 fronts. We're outnumbered in terms of Tories versus Lib Dems, and in terms of men versus women. And we may not be able to do anything in this current Parliament about Tory versus Lib Dems in the Cabinet, but I would be very disappointed if by the end of this 5 years in 2015, if it's still the same position that it is in terms of women in that room, because it's just not appropriate in the 21st century, particularly when there's a wealth of talent, perhaps in small quantities in our party and indeed in the Conservative Party. There's very many talented Conservative women who are not necessarily being given the chance that they always deserve. So I would like to end on an optimistic note, however. One of the events I was at in this slot was the leadership programme reception. And we have some smashing candidates there. Really excited, they're talking about going for selections, and I would just encourage you to get behind all of them, because we do have a bright future when it comes to women in the party. We've got a fantastic heritage to build on, and I do think that looking forward it's very exciting, and we should have a degree of optimism while recognising that we can't let up. We have to keep working. Thank you.
Very much, Jo, and I'm very happy to hand on the baton of winning to you. I did make a bid for the cabinet for you and me this morning in Independence.
I saw that. Well done.
I thought when they say how do you feel about there being no women in the cabinet, I always say, bad. And I trust that Nick is reading this.
Well, if he hasn't, then perhaps we should speak to his PPS and get him to wave under his
Perhaps you
nose.
could take care of that. And in terms of your mum, Jo, I'm sure seeing your phenomenal career and your phenomenal ability, she is more than proud of her daughter, even though she had to slog it with you. And I will just take the liberty as chair to tell one Shirley Williams tale, because she was my political heroine. And she asked me to have tea with her in the House of Commons. So tea with Shirley Williams. This isn't that long ago, I have to say, last year. And I shyly confessed, I said, Shirley, you are my political heroine. And she said, well, my dear, you're fast becoming one of mine. This was my moment. Anyway, we have heard an amazing history tonight, a continuum from our foremothers, sorry, trying to get that right, to our current day and our future. And I think you can see why liberalism that runs so strong. And I'm sure in constituencies, I sometimes go and meet an older woman for whatever reason, even older than myself. And I recognise that she was liberal in a time when no one else was liberal around her, not even her family. There is something indomitable in the spirit of liberal women. Anyway, I'm now going to just briefly ask a man to talk for 2 seconds to give Duncan a turn to make his pitch. Duncan, just before we go on to the
Sorry to bring the tone down. The agenda down. I just want to say a few words about the Lib Dem History Group, for those of you who aren't familiar with us. We were set up when the party was founded in 1988 to promote the discussion and research of historical topics related to liberalism, Liberal Democrats and our predecessor parties. And we do this in 3 main ways. First, through publishing this, the Quarterly Journal of Liberal History. This is the latest issue just out, issue number 76. A couple of articles in it I'd just like to draw to your attention. One on very recent history, looking at the experience of junior partners in coalition governments, looking at experience from Europe and from New Zealand. And it's called the Black Widow Effect. And those of you who know what Black Widows do to their mates will understand why the subtitle is Why Britain's Coalition Had an Unhappy Ending. Another article called God Gave the Land to the People, about the historical antecedents of the song that we sing at the Glee Club, and we may be singing in a few weeks' time. Subscription is only £20 a year, £12.50 for unwage, and it gets you lots of discounts of books that we publish and other people publish as well. Second thing we do is organise meetings like this one. I can tell you our next one is actually a full-day seminar in Birmingham, or together with Newman University College, on the Liberal Party unionism and political culture in late 19th and early 20th century Britain, and we've got leaflets about it on our stand. And then the one after that will be our next meeting in London in January. We've only just confirmed this, so no one else knows this information yet. 22nd of January, we will be holding a seminar on the project, the Ashdown-Blair project from the mid-90s, with actual participants in the events that happened, including Paddy Ashdown. Sadly not Tony Blair, but we have got Roger Little and Pat McFadden from the Labour side. So actually a discussion of what really happened 10, 15 years ago will be of interest, I think, and of course we'll have a fringe meeting at the next Lib Dem conference. Thirdly, we publish a range of books and booklets, and last year we launched this book, our latest one, Peace, Reform and Liberation, A History of Liberal Politics in Britain 1679 to 2011, so dead up to date as of last September, the most comprehensive and the most up-to-date history, single-volume history of liberal politics. And again, that's available on our stand. And of course, our very latest publication is this one, Mothers of Liberty, which we're launching tonight. A series of about 40 biographies of famous, or perhaps not so famous, women liberals who contributed to the development of liberalism or to the party or to both. And many of them are ones that we mentioned, or our speakers mentioned tonight. Our one criterion for including people in here was that their careers had come to an end because they're dead. So not everyone who's mentioned tonight is in here. The only exception to that we made was Shirley Williams, because we thought it was impossible to talk about women in politics without including her. We have, for example, all the women Liberal MPs, Barbara Shields, who's not alive, happily, many of the thinkers and organisers that were mentioned here, and as Jo said, many of the unsung heroes, like Claire Brooks, or Enid Legman, or Nancy Sear, who kept the party going in the very difficult times in the 50s and 60s. Now, you get this on our stand, you can also get it here, we have copies available for you here. So do come and visit us on our stand. It's on the ground floor in the exhibition. You can join our email mailing list for up-to-date information about our meetings. You can do that here. And just very finally, you could also just spend £1 and have a go at our quiz. And you will find that many of the answers, though not quite all of them, are available in this book.
Well, thank you, Duncan. Okay, so I think it was the most fascinating history, and I would like to open it up for comment or question. You, madam.
Well, I was going to ask Jo, actually, and picking up not really about the history, but in my, I come from Watford, and having watched people fight by-elections, it seems to me that it's very much predicated upon you either having a husband who's incredibly helpful, no small children, and an employer that will let you have vast amounts of time off. And I don't know what we can do, because I thought this is a really counterproductive to getting very able women who have the normal trappings of life into politics, and I feel that's something really needs to be addressed, and I don't know if you've got any ideas on how to do it.
Yeah, I'm going to take a few questions, then let Hannah come back on the appropriate one that they want to answer.
Violet was obviously keen on women's rights, but Asquith was not keen on women having the vote. So how did that work out?
I thought that question might come up.
I'd like to talk about Lady Violet, because growing up in the 1950s, she was the voice of liberalism on John Arlott, on any questions particularly. So, but the other problem about that is the person not you didn't mention, it was on the cover there, debate with the other daughter, shall we say. I mean, this is Paul Clement Davies said Lady Violet one side and Lady Meghan the other, and he was in the middle trying to comment on the other thing was to Jo. You mentioned 57 MPs. Is this the lady, including the lady from West Belfast, who was the line secretary, who got elected, not heard anything of?
You're only allowed one question.
Sorry, close to, sorry.
Yeah, I'm just being strict. Hannah, Jo, do you want to...
Yes, on the time for campaigning, well, answers on a postcard to be posted in the post office. It's not easy because at the end of the day we know that people that can go and knock on lots of doors as candidates are much more likely to get elected. So we might want to change the system that we have. We are working within the constraints of that. I think the nearest thing we can get to as a solution as the party is for the people in this room and beyond it to recognise some of those sacrifices or difficulties that women, and it's not just women by the way, parents and others that have caring responsibilities, or indeed if you're running your own business for example, that this makes it very difficult. And having the flexibility to work around that. Now, there is no substitute for candidates speaking personally to voters, whether that's on the telephone, which might be one way of solving it in some cases, or face to face. But it's even men have said this to me. Greg Mulholland, one of our colleagues, said, you know, if I'd had my children, you know, before I got elected, I don't think I'd been able to do it. I just wouldn't have been able to do what's required to be a winning candidate. Part of the problem, I think, is about what we ask our candidates to do. We expect them to do everything. And too many local parties fall into the trap of wherever there's something that needs to be done, we'll ask the candidate. So I think that, and the campaign start is getting better at this, part of it is about gearing up our local parties. It shouldn't just be about the MPs or candidates and the organisers, it also needs to be about local parties taking some responsibility, so that even if you do still need the candidate to go knocking on doors, seeing party donors, etc., someone else is arranging the appointments to see the party donors, and the candidate's not having to write the whole members' newsletter and DTP the leaflets when they get home at night. So, you know, I think there are things that can be done to improve that and make it a bit easier, although I don't think you're ever going to entirely eradicate the fact that there's a definite time commitment involved. On the 57 point, it would be lovely if Naomi Long from the Alliance acted as one of our party, and I think we had extended the offer to her to use our whip's office, but she does sit on the opposition benches rather than as part of the Liberal Democrat Party.
James, you just want to...
Yes, I mean, the fact is, as someone who defends my great-grandfather, and the elephant in the room is obviously the women voting. But I think in the case of Violet, it was just something that she just sort of wasn't really thinking about. And once she was a mature woman, she was an absolutely phenomenal, and as I was trying to say in what I said earlier, actually ahead of her time, supporter of women's rights, equal pay, etc., etc. And it's one of those things one finds hard to explain about Asquith, actually, considering the fact that he was a liberal. It has been suggested to me, and I grab it, that, of course, the original idea was that it was only women who had property who would get the vote, so that he saw this as a potential, rather like the recent realignment of seats, that this would actually benefit the Tory party. And I grab onto that as an explanation. Yeah.
Two more and then we're more or less done.
Yeah.
I think you and then you.
Yes, just work out.
Say who you are.
Yes, Jo Christie Smith, Lewisham, Beckham, North. For me, liberal feminism is as good as it gets, and liberalism does feminism really well. It has been a matter of great frustration and disappointment to me that liberal organisations don't do this very well, as evidenced by our lack of women in power, because surely the sharing and our own share of actual power is the freedom that we're looking for. And it seems to me that the Liberal Party, or the Liberal Democrat Party, sacrifices that for the pragmatic vote, going back to Asquith's theory that it would give Conservatives power if we let women with property vote. And that happens even today. Even in the last few years, I've had people argue to me online that it's okay, we don't need women because a liberal man will be able to vote the right way in Parliament for all of us.
Okay, Lisa.
I hope I'm allowed to say something in this discussion. I knew Lady Violet the 5 last years of her life, and I have correspondence to show it. Every vacation I would go and have tea with her. Cucumber sandwiches, whiskey was offered. At 18 or 19, that was a bit much for me. I became the candidate for Wells. She fought Wells in 1945. I asked her what was her campaign platform in 1945, and she said it was a tap in every house. That's very, very graphic, very practical, very grassroots. This was the person who was, more than any French politician, able to take on General de Gaulle on French media and wipe the floor.
Well, I mentioned that.
Yeah, which you mentioned, which she was both an internationalist and an excellent local campaigner. She fought 2 constituencies after the war, Wells and Colne Valley, both of which became Liberal Democrat held constituencies at various times. I fought the Wells constituency in 5 general elections. My recommendation on resigning as candidate was, it's time we had a woman candidate. Tessa Munt.
Are there any last comments from the floor or questions? I'm not sure there was an answer needed. In that case, I will bring this meeting to an end. I want to thank what I think has been the most fascinating evening in terms of this. Helen, and amazing to hear that history. Jane from your family, and Jo for the future. Maybe one day Prime Minister Jo. Thank you. Thank you.